Have you? I thought you must have been. Well, welcome, Caroline, and great apologies for rushing you so much. You're quite guilty now. Welcome everyone for coming here. Thank you all for coming. I've already said a little bit about combining this with the press and members, so because we're so short of time, I'll just pass over to Caroline, who's going to say a few words, and then we'll open it out to questions.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the warm welcome, and thank you to everybody who's been carrying suitcases, briefcases, coats and everything else as I've been hustled along from the station. I really appreciate it. I was asked to say just a few words about the cuts, and actually I could maybe rehearse some of the argument I just had with Radio York, because they were basically stuck in that same mindset as the government is trying to make everybody else to get stuck into, which is there is no alternative to these cuts. You know, and so the question is simply, what are you going to cut? And if you try to sort of go back a couple of paces and say, well, if the Greens were in charge, we wouldn't be doing it like this, you know, it's quite a difficult idea to get across to people at the moment, because they are so set in understanding from the government that we have to do it. And I think one of the big challenges we have is to make the case very loud and clear that these cuts are not an economic inevitability. They are an ideological choice. And I think that's something we have to keep saying over and over again. And not only are they an ideological choice, they are a completely socially devastating one. And we can already begin to see some of the impacts of these cuts, which seem to be almost deliberately designed to be hitting the poorest, hardest, and the vulnerable most of all. I mean, you'll have seen the figures from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, not known for its particularly progressive leanings. You know, even the IFS is saying, yes, these cuts will hit the poorest, hardest. And there's plenty of evidence that they'll hit women much harder than men, people from ethnic groups harder than white people. And essentially they are absolutely targeting the fabric that holds our society together. And so when I look at some of the people coming into my surgeries in Brighton, for example, there are cuts to housing benefit which will inevitably lead to greater homelessness. There's no question about that. All of the housing charities are saying this. Or when you look at the way in which the mobility allowance is being targeted for people with disabilities. You know, talk about people who don't have much and for whom that mobility allowance is the difference between feeling there's a purpose to their lives in order to be able to get out of sheltered accommodation sometimes and actually see other people and get out and about. Yet that mobility allowance is being targeted as well. Cuts to legal aid so people can't defend themselves. And on top of all of that, for this government to have the gall to suggest that these cuts are in any way fair, I think is absolutely insulting and completely untrue. But not only are these cuts socially devastating, I think we should also be saying that they are economically illiterate. That if we are trying to tackle the deficit, then the idea that you do it by this massive attack on public services, throwing out of work maybe 500,000 public sector workers, followed by maybe a knock-on effect with 500,000 private sector workers as well, the idea that that is a good way to address a deficit is simply a fantasy. That what we should be doing is keeping people in jobs, get their taxes into the revenue. You know, if you throw people out of work, not only do you have all of the social problems associated with that, but you lose their tax revenue, you pay their redundancy, you pay their unemployment and a whole set of other benefits, and actually you're not even saving very much money in any case, as well as having all of the social problems associated with that. So we need to keep people in jobs. And as Greens, you will know that one of the things that we believe is one of the fastest job creation programs you could imagine would be a real investment in energy efficiency, renewable energy. You know, the kinds of models that Kirklees have pioneered, where they are literally going street by street, insulating people's homes. Now, not only does that get emissions down, but it saves people about £150 a year on their fuel bills, and it's created around 120 jobs just in that part of Kirklees alone. That's the kind of model we need to see rolled out across the country. That is the way to tackle both the environmental crisis and the economic crisis, because in all of the discussion about the economic crisis, the environmental crisis has not gone away. And I think that's another thing that Greens have to be reminding people about, that the climate crisis is getting ever worse. And yes, of course, the economic crisis is serious. But if we don't act fast to deal with the climate crisis, then it will make what we're facing now look pretty small beer by comparison, serious though it undoubtedly is. And so when people say, well, where's the money going to come from for this investment in jobs? Then I think, you know, it just shows an extraordinary lack of imagination from government. I mean, you don't have to look terribly far to think about, well, you know, how about a tax on a windfall tax, for example, on bankers' bonuses. That's something we're going to be discussing at our conference in Cardiff at the end of the week. You don't have to be that imaginative to think, well, what about that Robin Hood tax? Even if you applied that in the UK alone, you could raise £20 billion from a Robin Hood tax. In other words, a tiny tax on financial transactions, which wouldn't affect ordinary people, but would affect big businesses that are doing those kinds of transactions. You know, if you scrapped Trident replacement, 100 billion over 30 years. You know, tax evasion, tax avoidance. This government is actually sacking people from the revenue, from HMRC. Yet these are the very people who could be tracking down the tax avoidance and tax evasion by the rich, which is again costing us around 13 billion of lost revenue every year out of the Treasury. So, you know, it's not the case that the money isn't there, it's the case that choices are being made about where we would take that money from. And, you know, when George Osborne tries to persuade us that, well, don't worry, I am dealing with the banks, I'm going to increase this bankers' levy, that sounds all very well until you also notice that what he's doing is reducing corporation tax for those very same banks. And so on balance, they're actually going to be better off, even at a time like this, even when, as a result of their irresponsibility, even when we own RBS, that bank, we simply still have no real control over what it's doing. And let me just finish by saying two things, really. I've just been to Sheffield, which of course was a key place when it came to the tuition fees opposition, the opposition to trebling tuition fees. And one of the things I was saying to the students in Sheffield is that the Lib Dem betrayal of their pledges on tuition fees are not only devastating for students, I think they're devastating for politics as a whole, because politics was never held in very much respect, as you will know. But after that Lib Dem betrayal, then it becomes even harder for anyone to talk about trusting politicians again. And I think that does matter, actually. I think it does matter that people should have and should be able to have trust in the people that represent them. Because what we need right now in this country is an effective opposition, and it's exactly what we don't have. We don't have an effective opposition, partly because the Lib Dems are now in coalition with the Tories and so cannot be an opposition, even if they wish to be, and because Labour, crucially, is so contaminated by so many of the issues that they would be apparently trying to oppose the government on. What do I mean by that? I mean, for example, that if they were opposing the government's crazy ideas on the NHS, putting more and more market forces in the NHS, essentially leading to the privatisation of the NHS, who started that off? Well, Labour did with PFI. If you're talking about the Labour opposition to tuition fees trebling, who first introduced tuition fees? Labour. Greens have always been against it. If you look at something like selling off the Royal Mail, whose idea was that? Well, Peter Mandelson, I'm afraid, sadly comes to mind. On a whole range of issues, the Labour does not have a leg to stand on when it comes to opposition, and I thought that even most obviously today when I was reading the papers about what's happening in Libya. And that sense of David Cameron going out there, and I felt so I don't know why I feel let down, because it's not really surprising, but to begin with, when I saw that he was in Tahrir Square in Cairo, I thought, that's great. Good old David Cameron going there. And then you discover that the reason he's there is because he's there with a delegation of arms manufacturers, and that's what he's doing, flogging arms in the Middle East at a time like this. And again, how can Labour object to that? Because that is simply carrying on the tradition that Tony Blair set in motion so well. So we do need to be an effective opposition, and we will be, and the Greens are that opposition, because Labour cannot be it. And so whether we're talking about the economy, or if we're talking about these wider social issues, or if we're talking about the environment, then it is the Greens who are in the forefront of the opposition. And let me quickly just finally say a few words on the environment. Cameron pledged that this was going to be the greenest government ever. Well, frankly, that's not a very big ambition, because Labour is so rubbish on the environment. But even saying that, what have they done so far? Well, you'll know, of course, about the very first thing they did when they came into power was to abolish the Sustainable Development Commission, which was the body which was precisely tasked with saying how green a government was. It was measuring whether or not governments were meeting their green aspirations, so a very good thing to abolish it so you don't have to have the embarrassment of not meeting those aspirations. Things like the Energy Savings Trust, the Carbon Trust, giving really good practical advice to individuals and companies about how to reduce their emissions, those are being cut dramatically as well. And of course, most recently we've had the sell-off of the forests, which was only stopped at the last minute when the sound of anger from people was so loud that even Caroline Spellman began to hear it and David Cameron began to hear it, and they finally did the U-turn on the forests. The Green Investment Bank is supposed to be this great bank, and it could be a fantastic bank if it was properly capitalised and if it was a real bank that could make real loans to really power the green revolution we need to see. But still there are fights going on in government as to whether it will be a fund or a bank, how much money it will have. There's no real ambition on that either. And so for that reason too, it's crucial that we have Greens at every level of government, even if it's just one or two. We want more, but even if it is only one or two, those Greens are there as whistleblowers, they are there as watchdogs, they are there to make sure that the other parties deliver on their pledges and to make sure that social and environmental justice are at the top of the agenda. That's why it's so important to be voting Green in York and everywhere else in the country, and I wish you very well in the campaign.